I woke up to the sound of slow, deliberate breathing, but it wasn't mine. Someone was in the room with me. My chest tightened as I turned my head inch by inch toward the sound. In the moonlight spilling through the window, I saw it. A figure crouched at the foot of my bed, its face tilted inhumanly sideways, eyes glinting like wet stones. It didn't move, but its breathing grew louder, raspier, as if it was excited I'd noticed. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My voice stayed trapped in my throat, my body frozen in place. Then it grinned, and I realized it wasn't breathing. It was mimicking mine. I locked the back door without a second thought. The crumpled note from earlier sat in the trash, forgotten. By 2:30 a.m., I was half asleep when I heard it. A faint, deliberate scratching at the back door. My eyes snapped open. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe a branch brushing against the house. But then it came again. Slow. Insistent. Scratch. 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 I sat up, my heart hammering. The sound grew louder, like fingernails dragging across wood. A shiver ran down my spine. Grabbing my phone for light, I tiptoed toward the back door, every creak of the floorboards making my breath catch. Through the peephole, I saw nothing, just the empty yard under the pale glow of the moon. But the sound didn't stop. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to make sense of it. The scratching shifted as if whatever it was knew I was listening. A faint shuffle followed, like feet dragging across the grass. A shadow passed over the peephole. I stumbled back, my phone slipping from my hand. My lungs felt tight as retreated to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. I climbed into bed, pulling the covers to my chin, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But as I lay there, the room felt different. The shadows on the walls seemed to ripple like water, even though the lights were off. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. My skin prickled, every nerve screaming to turn and look. But I was too afraid of what I might see. When I finally drifted off, it wasn't to peace. My dreams were filled with whispers, a cold hand on my shoulder, and the faint creak of my bedroom door opening. The next morning, still haunted by the restless shadows and the scratching at the door, I called the landlady. My fingers trembled as I dialed her number. "Hello?" Her voice was clipped, almost defensive, as if she'd been waiting for this call. "Hi, this is your tenant. I found this note with some, rules on it. Is this some kind of joke? Because last night—" "Follow them," she interrupted, her voice cold and final. "What? Look, I don't know what kind of prank—" "Follow them." Her tone darkened, almost a growl now. "It's not a joke. Break the rules and you'll regret it." I blinked, stunned by the sharpness of her words. What happens if I don't? Her breath caught, and she lowered her voice, almost whispering. "Don't make me explain." The line went dead before I could press further. That night, I locked the back door and checked it twice. By 1 a.m., I was lying awake, counting the minutes until morning. Then I heard it. Heavy, deliberate footsteps downstairs. Every muscle in my body tensed. My rational mind screamed it was impossible. The door was locked. But the sound continued, moving with purpose. I crept to the top of the stairs. The back door stood wide open, the lock dangling uselessly from the frame. My breath hitched. A loud crack echoed from the kitchen. I ran down, my heart pounding, to find shards of glass from a water cup scattered across the floor. I didn't leave the glass of water outside my door. I didn't think it mattered. But when I woke up, there were muddy footprints, starting at the bedroom door and stopping right beside my bed. The air smelled rancid, like rotting leaves and something metallic. My walls hummed faintly, a low vibration that seemed alive, watching me. I needed a distraction. Anything to pull my mind away from the footprints by my bed and the suffocating hum of the walls. Cleaning the attic seemed like a good idea, or at least it felt far away from the basement. The attic was a dusty, claustrophobic space with low beams and piles of forgotten junk. As I cleared a corner, my hand brushed something cool and hard. A book. It was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. Flipping it open, I saw shaky handwriting scrawled across the yellowed pages. The entries started mundane, complaints about the plumbing, notes on the neighbors. But then the tone changed. "The rules aren't for us." One entry read, "They're for the house." My fingers trembled as I turned the page. The writer described the same rules I'd found, the same strange events. Scratches at the door, whispers from nowhere, shadows that didn't belong. The last entry chilled me. "It knows when you're scared. Don't let it see you." The final sentence was smeared as though written in haste. "If you break a rule, it won't stop." That night, the house felt heavier. The corners of every room seemed darker, and the shadows didn't stay still. As I walked toward the kitchen, I heard it. Soft, guttural whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, closer. It was coming from the basement door. I couldn't take it anymore. I yanked the basement door open and flipped the light switch. The bulb exploded in a burst of sparks, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers erupted into a deafening roar, vibrating through my skull. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate creak. Something was climbing the stairs. The next morning I had a plan. Pack my bags and leave. The muddy footprints, the shattering bulb, and whatever had climbed the basement stairs, all of it was too much. I didn't care about losing my deposit or the absurd rules. I just needed to get out. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the car sputtered once and fell silent. I tried again, jamming my foot on the gas pedal. Nothing. My phone was next. No signal. Not even a single bar. I stepped out of the car, clutching my phone, when I saw her. The old woman from down the road, standing at the edge of my driveway, watching me. "You can't leave," she said, her voice flat, almost bored. "What?" I asked, my throat dry. "The house doesn't like disobedience," she said, tilting her head. Her milky eyes seemed to stare straight through me. "Apologize." She turned and walked away before I could ask her what she meant. I slammed the car door and stormed back inside, shaking with frustration. As soon as I stepped in, the air seemed heavier, the shadows darker. Then the kitchen chair slid across the floor, on its own. I jumped, stumbling back. The refrigerator door swung open, slamming into the counter with a force that rattled the room. I turned, catching movement in the corner of my eye. In the reflection of the microwave door, I saw it. A pale, grinning face with hollow eyes staring at me. I spun around, but nothing was there. My phone buzzed, startling me. It was the landlady. "You broke the rules," she hissed before I could speak. "One more chance. Follow them, or it'll be worse than you can imagine." The line went dead, and I realized I wasn't sure which scared me more, the house or the landlady. I didn't sleep that night. I'd followed every rule. The back door unlocked from 2 a.m. to 3 a.m., the basement light untouched after midnight, the glass of water outside my bedroom door. But when I woke up, the glass of water was still there, untouched. My chest tightened as I stared at it. Did I place it wrong? Did I miss something? Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl from the hallway. It was deep, wet, like something was dragging air through a throat too full of something else. The sound moved closer, each step deliberate, heavy. I clutched my blankets, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure it could hear me. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. My gaze flicked to the bedroom door, and there it was. The figure from the mirror. Its grin was too wide, the skin stretched impossibly thin over sharp teeth. Its eyes were black holes, swallowing the light. It stood there motionless, its head tilting slightly as if it was studying me. I squeezed my eyes shut, whispering prayers I hadn't said since I was a child. When I opened them again, it was gone. Shaking, I grabbed the journal from the attic. I read every word, desperate to understand. The rules weren't random. They were rituals. Rituals to keep it at bay. The house wasn't haunted. It was alive, and it had a resident. Something that wasn't human. The journal warned, "It only needs a mistake to come closer. It feeds on fear. If you break the rules, you're inviting it in." I dug deeper, scouring old newspapers and archives online. Every tenant who lived here had vanished or died. One article described a family found in their locked home, their faces frozen in silent screams. Another tenant had left a single sentence on the wall in red paint before disappearing. "It watches, and it waits." I realized then, I wasn't just following the rules to live. I was trying to survive something that didn't want me to leave. "The rules aren't for us," one entry read. "They're for the house." My fingers trembled as I turned the page. The writer described the same rules I'd found, the same strange events. Scratches at the door, whispers from nowhere, shadows that didn't belong. The last entry chilled me. "It knows when you're scared. Don't let it see you." The final sentence was smeared as though written in haste. "If you break a rule, it won't stop." That night, the house felt heavier. The corners of every room seemed darker, and the shadows didn't stay still. As I walked toward the kitchen, I heard it. Soft, guttural whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, closer. It was coming from the basement door. I couldn't take it anymore. I yanked the basement door open and flipped the light switch. The bulb exploded in a burst of sparks, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers erupted into a deafening roar, vibrating through my skull. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate creak. Something was climbing the stairs. The next morning I had a plan. Pack my bags and leave. The muddy footprints, the shattering bulb, and whatever had climbed the basement stairs. All of it was too much. I didn't care about losing my deposit or the absurd rules. I just needed to get out. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the car sputtered once and fell silent. I tried again, jamming my foot on the gas pedal. Nothing. My phone was next. No signal. Not even a single bar. I stepped out of the car, clutching my phone, when I saw her. The old woman from down the road, standing at the edge of my driveway, watching me. "You can't leave," she said, her voice flat, almost bored. "What?" I asked, my throat dry. "The house doesn't like disobedience," she said, tilting her head. Her milky eyes seemed to stare straight through me. "Apologize." She turned and walked away before I could ask her what she meant. I slammed the car door and stormed back inside, shaking with frustration. As soon as I stepped in, the air seemed heavier, the shadows darker. Then the kitchen chair slid across the floor, on its own. I jumped, stumbling back. The refrigerator door swung open, slamming into the counter with a force that rattled the room. I turned, catching movement in the corner of my eye. In the reflection of the microwave door, I saw it. A pale, grinning face with hollow eyes staring at me. I spun around, but nothing was there. My phone buzzed, startling me. It was the landlady. "You broke the rules," she hissed before I could speak. "One more chance. Follow them, or it'll be worse than you can imagine." The line went dead, and I realized I wasn't sure which scared me more, the house or the landlady. I didn't sleep that night. I'd followed every rule. The back door unlocked from 2 a.m. to 3 a.m., the basement light untouched after midnight, the glass of water outside my bedroom door. But when I woke up, the glass of water was still there, untouched. My chest tightened as I stared at it. Did I place it wrong? Did I miss something? Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl from the hallway. It was deep, wet, like something was dragging air through a throat too full of something else. The sound moved closer, each step deliberate, heavy. I clutched my blankets, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure it could hear me. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. My gaze flicked to the bedroom door, and there it was, the figure from the mirror. Its grin was too wide, the skin stretched impossibly thin over sharp teeth. Its eyes were black holes, swallowing the light. It stood there, motionless, its head tilting slightly as if it was studying me. I squeezed my eyes shut, whispering prayers I hadn't said since I was a child. When I opened them again, it was gone. Shaking, I grabbed the journal from the attic. I read every word, desperate to understand. The rules weren't random. They were rituals. Rituals to keep it at bay. The house wasn't haunted. It was alive, and it had a resident. Something that wasn't human. The journal warned, it only needs a mistake to come closer. It feeds on fear. If you break the rules, you're inviting it in. I dug deeper, scouring old newspapers and archives online. Every tenant who lived here had vanished or died. One article described a family found in their locked home, their faces frozen in silent screams. Another tenant had left a single sentence on the wall in red paint before disappearing. It watches, and it waits. I realized then, I wasn't just following the rules to live. I was trying to survive something that didn't want me to leave. I jolted awake to the sound of heavy breathing, too close, far too close. My heart stopped as I realized it wasn't coming from me. Turning my head, I froze. A shadowy figure crouched at the foot of my bed, its hollow eyes gleaming in the dark. Before I could scream, it whispered in my voice, "You shouldn't have opened the wall." The next morning, sunlight barely filtered through the attic's grime-coated windows as Elliot stood staring at the false wall he'd pried open the night before. The narrow passage loomed dark and silent, but the faint scratching sound still lingered in his mind. Gripping a flashlight tightly, he stepped inside. The walls of the passage were damp and cold, their surfaces rough and uneven like they'd been carved out in haste. His breath echoed faintly as he moved, the narrow space pressing in on him. The deeper he went, the more the air thickened, carrying the pungent smell of decay that grew stronger with every step. The beam of his flashlight caught the edges of a hidden room at the end of the corridor. The space was unnervingly small, its stone walls seeping with moisture. At the center stood an ancient wooden table, its surface carved with intricate patterns, eyes, hundreds of them, staring up at him with eerie precision. A single chair sat in front of it, leather straps hanging loosely from its arms and legs, as though waiting to restrain its next occupant. On the table, a journal lay open, its pages stained and torn. Elliot leaned closer to read, his fingers trembling as he traced the words written in jagged, uneven handwriting. "Never stay past the third night. It sees you." A shiver ran down his spine as the oppressive weight in the room intensified, pressing against his chest. From behind him came the faintest sound, a whisper, soft and indistinct. Elliot spun around, his flashlight slicing through the darkness, but the corridor was empty. Still, the whispers didn't stop, now growing fainter, retreating back into the passage. Elliot sat hunched on the living room couch, the journal resting heavily in his lap. The pages were yellowed and brittle, stained with dark smudges that might have been ink or something else. He flipped through it carefully, the early entries calm and deliberate, describing mundane details about the house, its creaks, drafts, and odd placement of the attic door. But as he turned the pages, the handwriting shifted. Neat lines gave way to frantic, jagged scrawls, the ink pressed so hard it bled through the pages. "The room isn't empty. It watches." The words leapt out at him, making his chest tighten. He flipped the page, his breath shallow. The next entry was written over and over again, filling the page in wild spirals. "Don't let it know your name." Elliot frowned, shaking his head. The final page was worse. Short, clipped sentences trailed into nonsense, with one line circled so many times it tore the paper. "Once you find it, it finds you." The journal fell from his hands, hitting the coffee table with a soft thud. His laugh was nervous, hollow. "Just some old ramblings," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. But the words stayed with him, crawling under his skin like they'd been written just for him. A faint tapping broke the silence. He froze, his gaze darting to the wall opposite him. It came again, soft, deliberate. The rhythm was unnatural, not the random creaks of an old house settling. He stood, heart pounding, and took a hesitant step toward the sound. His fingers grazed the wall, which felt colder than it should. The tapping stopped. In the suffocating silence that followed, Elliot swore he heard it. A whisper so faint it could have been his imagination. It wasn't. Elliot tried to shake off the unease, telling himself it was just an old house and his imagination running wild. But by the third night, he couldn't ignore it anymore. His keys, left on the counter, reappeared in the bathroom sink, dripping wet. His phone, which he swore he'd placed on the nightstand, was found under his bed, its screen cracked. The tapping, once faint and distant, was now louder, coming from the walls nearest to him. It followed him from room to room, pausing whenever he turned his head, as if daring him to look. The worst was the mirror. While brushing his teeth, Elliot caught his reflection out of the corner of his eye, and for a fleeting second, it didn't move with him. It just stood there, staring back with a subtle, almost imperceptible tilt of its head. His toothbrush clattered into the sink as he stumbled back, his breath quickening. When he looked again, it was just him, haggard, pale, and trembling. Sleep became impossible. Each night, the whispers grew louder, calling his name in a voice too familiar to ignore. "Elliot," it breathed from the darkness of the hallway. "Elliot," it hissed from just behind his bedroom door. The sound was soft, like the caress of wind through a crack, but it carried a weight that froze him in place. On the fifth night, Elliot woke suddenly, the air heavy and damp. His heart thudded painfully as he noticed them, muddy footprints smeared across the floor. They led from the attic door to his bedroom, stopping just inches from his bed. The shape of each step was impossibly wide, as if they didn't belong to human feet. He sat frozen, clutching the blanket as the familiar tapping started again. This time, it came from inside the walls of his room. A whisper, low and guttural, accompanied it. "You can't leave." Elliot's fingers hovered over his phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, but he hesitated. The journal's words screamed in his mind. Once you find it, it finds you. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it wanted him to stay. The whispers hadn't stopped. They followed Elliot wherever he went, faint but relentless, like a distant conversation just out of reach. Desperation clawed at him as he found himself back in the attic, staring at the hidden passage. The journal lay open in his trembling hands, the warnings screaming at him to stay away. But he needed answers. Armed with his flashlight, he descended once more into the narrow corridor. The air was colder than before, the damp walls slick against his shoulder as he squeezed through. When he reached the room, something had changed. The carvings on the table were deeper now. The crude patterns of eyes and spirals seemed to move in the flickering light, following him as he stepped closer. Underneath the table, Elliot found a rusted lockbox, its lid slightly ajar. Inside were fragments of lives long forgotten, a faded photograph of a family in front of the house, their faces violently scratched out, a key that felt unnaturally heavy in his hand, and a crumpled note that simply read, "The door locks from the inside." Before he could react, the door to the passage slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing like a gunshot. His flashlight flickered as he threw himself at the door, screaming, clawing at the wood. From the other side came a sound he'll never forget, low, guttural breathing that matched his own terrified gasps. When the door finally creaked open, the passage was empty, but its walls were now covered in deep, jagged claw marks. Elliot stood at the front door, gripping the handle so tightly his knuckles turned white. He yanked with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. The lock, the hinges, everything looked normal, but the door wouldn't move, as if it were welded shut. Frustrated, he grabbed a chair and hurled it at the window. It bounced off with a dull thud, leaving the glass unscathed. Outside, the world looked muted, like he was peering through a thick sheet of fog. Birds flew by, but no sound reached his ears. His phone offered no help. Calls to friends rang endlessly, unanswered, and texts refused to send. Even his reflection on the darkened screen felt strange, the faintest smirk tugging at its lips when he wasn't smiling. That night, Elliot's dreams turned into a labyrinth of terror. He found himself strapped to the chair in the secret room, unable to move as shadowy figures emerged from the walls. Their glowing eyes pierced him, unblinking, while a low, guttural hum filled the air. One of them leaned closer, its face featureless but suffocatingly close, whispering, "You belong here now." When he woke, his body was soaked in cold sweat, but the dream clung to him like cobwebs. The smell of damp earth lingered in his bedroom, and muddy smears stained the floor near his bed. Desperation crept into every corner of his mind. Elliot tried the doors again, every window, even the attic hatch, but nothing worked. The house felt alive, its walls pulsating faintly when he pressed his hand against them. He screamed until his throat burned, but no one came. The world beyond the house seemed to forget him, and he was starting to believe the house wanted it that way. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a fleeting shadow slipping into the secret passage. It was waiting. Elliot sat upright in bed, his chest heaving as the voice echoed again. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was deep, resonant, and unmistakable. Elliot. The sound came from the secret passage, vibrating through the walls like a heartbeat. He froze, clutching the key he'd found in the lockbox. It was cold, heavier than it should have been, as though it carried a weight he couldn't understand. Summoning what courage he had left, Elliot grabbed a flashlight and descended into the passage. The corridor seemed longer now, the walls slick with something warm and sticky. His breath caught as the room came into view. It was no longer the cramped space he had first discovered. The walls throbbed like a living thing, and the carvings on the table now glowed faintly, their shapes shifting under his gaze. At the center of the room sat a figure, its form shrouded in shadows. Its glowing eyes blinked, 8 of them, arranged in an unnatural pattern. The air thickened as it spoke, its voice scraping against Elliot's mind. "You opened the door. Now you are mine." Panic surged as Elliot lunged for the table, fumbling to fit the key into the carving at its center. The entity stood, its form towering and amorphous. As the walls closed in and the table shook, Elliot realized the key might not unlock freedom, but something far worse. The key slipped into the carving with a sickening click, and the room shuddered violently. Elliot's flashlight flickered, the shadows around him convulsing as the entity screeched, a sound so piercing it felt like it would split his skull. The figure dissolved into thick black smoke, swirling in the confined space before vanishing into the walls. For a fleeting moment, the room was silent, the carvings dimming to an almost lifeless gray. Elliot staggered backward, his heart pounding as he realized he was still alive. Relief washed over him, but it didn't last. The walls trembled, cracks spiderwebbing outward as the room seemed to breathe. The smell of damp earth filled his nose, more potent than ever, and he felt the floor quiver beneath his feet. Then, the whispers started, louder this time, overlapping and relentless. The journal's warnings echoed in his mind. Once you find it, it finds you. Panic surged as he turned toward the passage, but the walls were already shifting, closing in on him. The space between them narrowed, forcing him to hunch as he scrambled toward the attic. The passage pulsed like a living thing, the air thick and suffocating. The sound of scraping claws followed him, relentless and gaining ground. He tripped, his knees slamming into the cold, wet floor, but he clawed his way forward. Behind him, a low, guttural growl reverberated through the corridor. Bursting into the attic, Elliot slammed the false wall shut and collapsed against it, gasping for air. The house groaned around him, as though dissatisfied with his escape. He pressed his ear to the wall, listening to the heavy, rhythmic thuds of something pacing just on the other side. The realization hit him like ice. The room wasn't part of the house. The room was the house, and it wasn't finished with him yet. Elliot's breath caught as his gaze locked with the figure in the attic window. It wasn't just his face. It was something wearing his face. Its hollow eyes bore into him, a cruel mimicry of his own despair. His legs trembled as he turned away, forcing himself to keep moving. "It's over," he whispered, trying to convince himself. But the house wouldn't let him leave. The air turned heavy, each step toward the car feeling like he was wading through syrup. The wind died, the world unnaturally still. Behind him, the house groaned, a low, guttural sound like a deep inhale. Elliot didn't look back. He threw his bags into the car and slid into the driver's seat, his hands shaking as he jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, but before he could pull away, a shadow darted across the rearview mirror. His stomach dropped. Turning slowly, he saw it. The thing from the attic now sitting in his back seat, its grin stretching impossibly wide. Its voice low and guttural, echoed in his head. "You can't leave. You are the house now." Elliot screamed, slamming the door open and stumbling into the street. The car door slammed shut on its own, the shadowy figure now at the wheel. The car rolled away, its headlights flickering, and disappeared into the fog. Elliot stood frozen, the house looming behind him. A sudden tapping came from the front door, faint but insistent. It wasn't inviting him back. It was welcoming someone new. "If you dare, share this story. But remember, every retelling brings it closer to you. Are you sure your house is empty? Or is it waiting for you to find its secret room?" It wasn't mine. The rasping breaths came faster as I opened my eyes, and a shadowed figure loomed inches from my face, its hollow eyes gleaming. Before I could scream, a cold, bony finger brushed my lips, and it whispered in my voice, "You shouldn't have broken the rules." I blinked and it was gone, but the closet door behind me creaked open. From the darkness, my own voice laughed. I woke up to a heavy silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing against their ears like a weight. They sat up, blinking into the darkness, and their chest tightened as they noticed the shadows in the corners of the room. They weren't still. The faint glow of the streetlight outside cast enough illumination to reveal what shouldn't have been possible. The shadows were moving. They stretched slowly, unnaturally, toward the bed, their inky tendrils crawling across the walls and floor. "Jesus Christ," Elliot muttered, fumbling for the bedside lamp. Their hands shook as they clicked it on, flooding the room with yellow light. The shadows recoiled instantly, snapping back into place like rubber bands. For a moment, Elliot just sat there, staring at the empty corners of the room. Their skin prickled, and a bead of sweat ran down the back of their neck. They forced a nervous laugh. "I'm overtired," they whispered, lying back down, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, they decided it was all in their head. Grabbing the list of rules, they crumpled it up and tossed it into the trash. "I'm not playing this stupid game," they muttered, heading to work. But unease followed them all day, and it spiked when they got home. Something felt off, like the room had shifted in their absence. Then they noticed it. Dad's old watch, the one they kept on their dresser, was gone. They tore the apartment apart, their breath quickening, but there was no sign of it. When they returned to the kitchen, a cold chill washed over them. Sitting neatly on the counter was a new envelope. Inside was the same list of rules, now with a fifth line: "Never discard the rules." Elliot stood frozen, staring at the new envelope on the counter. Their hands trembled as they tore it open. The same rules were there, but now, a fifth line stared back at them in sharp red ink. "Never discard the rules." The words sent a chill down their spine. Something had taken Dad's watch. No, erased it. But as Elliot reread the rules, the air around them shifted. The room suddenly felt suffocating, the walls too close. the silence too loud. Over the next day, it got worse. Food turned sour moments after being opened. Elliot watched in horror as a fresh apple browned and rotted in their hand, disintegrating into a mushy pulp. Their phone buzzed constantly with missed calls, numbers with no caller ID, all time-stamped 3:13 a.m. They grabbed their phone to call Sophia. Her voice sounded distant, unsure. "Elliot, I don't know who you're talking about. Are you okay?" The line went dead, leaving only static. Elliot barely slept that night, clutching the rules tightly as if they could shield them from what was coming. When the soft, deliberate knocking began at their bedroom door, they froze. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't demanding. But it felt patient, like something waiting to be invited in. Elliot didn't move, didn't breathe. The knocking stopped, replaced by a faint whisper. "Elliot, you're breaking the rules." The rules slid from their trembling hands as they realized it came from inside the room. Elliot sat at the edge of their bed, clutching the crumpled list of rules in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The knocking had stopped hours ago, but the whisper still echoed in their head. "You're breaking the rules." "Enough of this," they muttered, jaw clenched. The rules couldn't be real. This had to be a trick, a cruel prank, or worse, their own mind unraveling. Either way, they decided to test it. Elliot waited until 3:01 a.m. Then, they shut off every light in the apartment, plunging it into absolute darkness. At first, nothing happened. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive, but there was no knocking, no whispers. Elliot let out a shaky laugh, half relief, half hysteria. "See?" They whispered to no one. "It's nothing." But the temperature in the room plummeted. Their breath became visible, a faint white cloud in the pitch black. And then, across the room, the window shifted. Elliot turned, the beam of the flashlight trembling in their hand, but the reflection in the glass didn't match. It stood, grinning, as Elliot remained frozen in place. Slowly, the reflection waved, then turned and walked away, leaving the real Elliot staring into empty space. They scrambled to turn the lights on, panting, and ran to the bathroom mirror. In the harsh fluorescent glow, their reflection stared back with hollow black eyes and mouthed two words: "You're next." By morning, everything was gone. Their bank account, their job, even their identity. Elliot paced their apartment, the rules clenched tightly in one hand. The reflection's hollow eyes and mocking grin haunted their thoughts. This wasn't a prank. It wasn't just their imagination. With trembling fingers, Elliot opened their laptop and typed, strange rules appearing into the search bar. Most results were useless. Urban legends, clickbait articles. But buried on the second page was a link to a forum thread. The rules, real, or psychological torture? The thread was filled with desperate, fragmented posts. People described receiving lists of bizarre rules just like Elliot's. One person wrote, "At first I thought it was a joke. Then things started disappearing. My cat, my wedding ring, memories of my mom. It doesn't stop." Another post described identical symptoms: shifting shadows, distorted reflections, phantom whispers in the dark. But one post froze Elliot in their tracks. It was from a user named Rulebreaker88. "I thought I could beat it. Burned the list, ignored the warnings, but the rules don't just take, they replace. My shadow isn't mine anymore. My own voice whispers to me at night. Whatever it is, it wants me to break them. Don't fall for it." Elliot scrolled further, heart pounding. One final post caught their eye. "There's only one way out. But the price? It's everything you are." The thread ended there. Every account linked to the posts had been deleted. Elliot stared at the screen, nausea creeping up their throat. A soft sound pulled their attention to the hallway. The apartment door was open, just a crack. And then from the other side, Elliot stared at the list of rules, their hands trembling with rage. The whispers, the shadows, the hollow-eyed reflection, they were all designed to break them. But if the entity thought they would keep playing, it was wrong. They ripped the rules from the counter, their breaths sharp and uneven. "If it wants me, it'll have to come and get me," Elliot muttered. With deliberate care, they broke every rule. The clock read 3:01 a.m. when they turned off all the lights, plunging the apartment into suffocating darkness. Elliot stood in front of the bathroom mirror, locking eyes with the grinning, mismatched reflection. "Come on," they said, voice cracking. "Show me what you've got." At first, silence. Then, the apartment began to warp. The floor rippled under their feet, and the walls stretched, their texture bleeding into something alive. The faint scent of rotting fruit thickened the air, making Elliot gag. From the kitchen, a familiar voice called out, "Elliot, sweetheart, it's me." Their mother's voice. It cracked, trembling, as if she were crying. "I'm here, baby. Please come to me." Elliot's knees buckled and their chest tightened. They knew it wasn't real. It couldn't be real, but the sound cut deep, pulling at their resolve. "No," they whispered, forcing themselves to stay rooted. Suddenly, the shadows in the room pooled together, rising into a towering figure. It leaned forward, a shape of hollow eyes and jagged whispers, and spoke in Elliot's voice. "Breaking the rules costs more than you can pay. What do you want from me?" Elliot screamed, tears streaming down their face. The figure grinned wider. Its voice was calm, almost kind. "You, everything." The lights flickered, and the room disappeared into darkness. Elliot stood motionless as the shadowed figure loomed closer. Its hollow eyes seemed endless, pulling at them with an invisible force. The air was thick, charged with a low, droning hum that vibrated through their skull. Then it spoke, and its voice was layered, calm, cruel, and terribly familiar, as if 1,000 versions of Elliot spoke at once. "You've broken the rules, Elliot. The cost is everything." Elliot's knees buckled, but they forced themselves to stay standing. "What do you mean?" Their voice cracked, barely louder than a whisper. The figure tilted its head, too sharp, too deliberate. "A choice," it said. "Obey the rules forever, and keep what's left. Your scraps, your empty memories, or—" The room warped around Elliot, flickering with fragments of their past. Dad's watch, Sophia's laugh, Mom's hand holding theirs as a child. The images twisted and faded as the figure continued. "Break free. But you'll lose everything that makes you you. No memories, no identity, no place in the world." Elliot's chest heaved, their mind reeling. "You've already taken everything that mattered," they shouted, tears streaming. The figure laughed, a deep, vibrating sound. "Not yet." Desperation clawed at Elliot's throat. Their hand brushed against broken glass on the floor, sharp and cold. Gritting their teeth, they grabbed it and stabbed it into their palm. Blood spilled, hot and sticky, as they smeared it across the list. "I'm not yours," Elliot screamed, their voice raw and trembling. "Take it all if you have to, but I won't play your game." The figure paused, its grin stretching wider. "As you wish." The room trembled, the walls collapsing inward, shadows pouring over Elliot like water. They felt themselves dissolve, fading into the dark. A voice whispered, "You've lost more than you know." The walls rippled like water, bending and stretching as Elliot clutched their bleeding hand. The shadows didn't just cover the room, they devoured it. Every object dissolved into black smoke, twisting upward into the air like a reverse waterfall. "No!" Elliot screamed, stumbling backward, but there was no ground to catch them. The floor had vanished, replaced by a yawning abyss. They fell to their knees, the void closing in as the apartment imploded around them. Every sound warped and fractured, as if the universe itself were breaking apart. The figure loomed closer, its grin impossibly wide. "You broke the rules. Now, reality breaks for you." Elliot tried to move, to run, but their limbs felt heavy, like they were sinking into quicksand. Around them, familiar objects twisted into grotesque parodies. Their father's watch stretched and cracked, the face spinning backward. The photo of their mother wept black tears, her face smudged and fading. The shadows swarmed, pressing against Elliot's skin like icy hands. The figure's laughter echoed, a deafening roar that reverberated through their skull. You chose freedom. Now you are nothing. With a final, crushing snap, the room collapsed entirely. Elliot screamed as they were flung into the void, tumbling through darkness. When they opened their eyes, they were standing in the rain. Elliot sat on the park bench, the crumpled list burning cold in their pocket. The world around them seemed normal, children playing, cars humming by, but it all felt distant, like they were watching a silent film through frosted glass. People walked past without so much as a glance, their faces blurry and unfamiliar. Their reflection in the puddle hadn't moved. It stared up at them, those hollow black eyes unblinking, the edges of its mouth twitching into a grin. Elliot looked away, chest heaving, clutching their head as the whispers started again. You broke the rules, Elliot. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was everywhere, rustling in the leaves, murmuring from the people walking by, echoing from deep within Elliot's own mind. I followed them. I tried to... Elliot's voice cracked as they screamed at nothing, at everything. The whispers stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then from directly behind them, a voice said in a cold, familiar tone, No, you didn't. Elliot spun around, but no one was there. Just a trail of shadows stretching unnaturally long in the fading sunlight. The air thickened as the shadows began to shift, rising like smoke, swirling into the outline of a figure. The list fell from Elliot's pocket, fluttering to the ground. A new line appeared at the bottom, written in deep red. 4. Never let them see your fear. The figure stepped closer, its grin impossibly wide. Elliot's knees buckled as they clutched their chest. The puddle rippled, and their reflection whispered, Are you ready to follow the rules again? The apartment building was gone, replaced by an empty lot. The world was eerily still, the silence ringing in their ears. They staggered forward, calling out, but their voice seemed to evaporate into the damp air. From the puddles on the ground, hollow black eyes stared back at them. A reflection that wasn't theirs. Behind them, a faint whisper rose. It's not over.